verbal diarrhea pushed the U.S. into a nuclear war with Russia. He's doing his damnedest after his latest Putin gaffe. And the White House, once again, cleaning up the mess. For more than a month, Putin's military has been terrorizing the people of Ukraine. Most of the civilized world is begging him to stop. But over the weekend, the president said something that has many world leaders scratching their heads like there's a lice outbreak. Watch.
We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Yeah, it's the freestyling there at the end that's caused the problem. The Kremlin claims they're outraged by the comments and now call it a, quote, personal insult. Even our allies in France say it was a potentially dangerous escalation. And of course, it wasn't the only screw up. We had a three-fer this weekend. Biden also accidentally claimed U.S. troops are heading into Ukraine and suggested the U.S. could use chemical weapons. That's fun. Today at the White House, at least a half a dozen reporters asked the president to clarify, including our own Peter Doocy. Watch.
Are you worried that other leaders in the world are going to start to doubt that America is back if some of these big things that you say on the world stage keep getting walked back?
What's getting walked back?
It made it sound like, just in the last couple days, it sounded like you told U.S. troops they were going to Ukraine. It sounded like you said it was possible the U.S. would use a chemical weapon, and it sounded like you were calling for regime change in Russia, and we know...
None of the three occurred.
None of the three occurred?
None of the three.
Mr. President?
You interpret the language that way. I was talking to the troops. We were talking about helping train the troops that are the Ukrainian troops that are in Poland. That's what the context. I sat there with those guys for a couple hours. That's what we talked about.
So when you said you're going to see when you're there, you were not intending to
I was referring to meeting with and talking with the Ukrainian troops who are in Poland.
And when you said a chemical weapon use by Russia would trigger a response in kind.
It will trigger a significant response.
What does that mean?
I'm not going to tell you. Why would I tell you? You got to be silly.
The world wants to know?
The world wants to know a lot of things. I'm not telling them what the response would be. Then Russia knows the response.
He doesn't know what in kind means. All of those things happened. He said all of those things, and they all had to be cleaned up by multiple people. Regardless, the question now, can world leaders trust what comes out of President Putin-Mouth's mouth if every statement shows up with a disclaimer? Let's meet tonight's party panel. We've got the Federalist senior editor. His name is Christopher Bedford. Back in action, love to see it. Democrat strategist, radio host, single-handedly holding up the City of Angels, Leslie Marshall is here. And director of the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com, where he serves as editorial director, Scott Horton. Very nicely done in advance, everyone, because I know this is going to be fiery, and I like it. So, Chris, the president said three things that multiple people in his administration had to completely walk back. There's no one to blame for this but the president. Do you think he doesn't know what those words mean?
And he doesn't remember them, at least that's what he's claiming here. The walk back from the staff for this man cannot remain in power was just absolutely priceless. It reminded me of something I might have said to a high school teacher when I was clearly caught red-handed. Said, oh no, we don't want him to remain in power to continue to wage war in Ukraine. It's not at all what he said. None of those things are what he said. And it's just wild to see this coming from this president, and it's so common to see it coming from this president. You totally could have seen it coming on the campaign trail when you saw Joe Biden basically switching between a whisper and a scream every time he was ever out there. But now he's actually the world leader. These things have consequences. You've got a U.S. senator calling for the assassination of Putin, Joe Biden calling for his regime ouster. If you're Russia then or anyone else in the world, you're looking at this and you can barely figure it out, but you know it's dangerous.
You also know the intent of the words, Leslie. Do you share the president's actual sentiment that Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power?
I think the world does, or the majority of the world. I certainly think a majority of Americans do, or at least the polling says. Joe Biden keeps saying he's not walking it back because he didn't mean it as a gaffe. One thing we've seen from Joe Biden even before he was president is he shoots from the hip, no malarkey, right? He has talked about this guy being a butcher. He has talked about this guy being a thug. He has talked about this guy being a war criminal, and that is the sentiment of the world. And then you have Dmitry Petrov, who was spokesman for the Kremlin, who basically shrugged his shoulders. He wasn't really had his feathers ruffled about this, and said the people of Russia, very tongue-in-cheek, obviously, will decide if there's going to be a regime change in Russia. We know that not to be true. The people of Russia don't have any freedom when it comes to electing or getting rid of Vladimir Putin. And right now, when you look at what's going on and what they may discuss at the table tomorrow between Zelensky and Putin, you don't have, Vladimir Putin is not going to be upset by this. This is not going to change our relationship with them, because this is a man who's very upset that his strategic military war is a failure. And he's using words like disarmament and neutrality, and he may be giving up a lot more. Certainly he's not going to get the list that he asked for from Zelensky and Ukraine.
Well, I know when the president opens his mouth and a list falls out and people behind him go, what he meant to say was, whenever you have to do that kind of a clarification, you have failed. You have failed in your words, you have failed in your messaging, and he is failing as president, Scott.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, it's just insane to think. Here we have a border dispute with Russia on their border, 5,000 miles east of Washington, D.C., and we have absolutely incompetent leadership. We have to count on the fact that hopefully the FSB has briefed Putin that the President of the United States is a senile old coot, and don't take what he says too seriously, especially when he's threatening chemical attacks and these kinds of things. However, Kenny, I got to say, I think his slip up on regime change there was saying the quiet part out loud. It is American policy, clearly, to seek regime change in Russia. That's part of why they want to prolong this war. As they've said, as Admiral Stavridis said to the New York Times, we want to bog them down and replicate the dirty war in Afghanistan, the dirty war in Syria, to bleed Russia. And as Niall Ferguson, the British hawk, wrote in Bloomberg this week, that he has multiple sources inside the Democrats close to the White House saying to him the policy is to prolong this war to weaken Putin until the point that his regime collapses. They're threatening nuclear war, essentially. They're on a policy that is the most dangerous policy that they could possibly have. And you have the president, I think, accidentally revealing the truth of that.
See,
They threatened that for a very long time, regime change in Russia, going back to the Obama years.
And then they all say that that's not what they're doing, and, Biden's just going to give him an attaboy. I get all that, but he's not Nana screaming at the TV. That was one of my biggest problems with President Trump, is he sometimes didn't realize that he was president, and he would say the quiet part out loud. But this is the president of the United States, and it's sad. It's tragic that he can't freestyle. He has to stick to a script, because if he diverges, that could be the first shot in a war that gets tens of millions of people killed. So, my God, we have to hold him to a much higher standard. And the term in kind means we're going to do the exact same thing. Now, meanwhile, President Biden's approval rating has dropped to a new low. This is fun. Just 40% of Americans in a new NBC News poll think he's doing a bang-up job. Just 40%. 71% expressed low confidence in Biden's ability to handle the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. 8 in 10 worry the tensions will result in higher gas prices for Americans and maybe even lead to a nuclear war. The poll was conducted before Biden's trip to Europe, but after we saw what happened, could his approval drop even further, Chris?
I think it absolutely could. This is not an administration that's capable of righting itself, because the president is seemingly having fading faculties, and the vice president hasn't shown that she's able to stand up and pick up the job. She's very unpopular with Democrats as well. Moreover, if you look at the president's budget, which is a pretty good idea of where the administration wants to go, they're cutting money to the border, to border enforcement. They're not focusing on a lot of the things the Americans want. I understand that they're starting to move right now, finally, based on polling. Now, I guess COVID is over. We've moved on to war, because that's where the polling is. We want to save Ukraine. without using any U.S. troops or without getting in a war somehow. And we want to let the kids finally unmask because people are getting sick of it. But you can't just be reacting that way. They need to have a policy. And right now, the policies they have don't seem to be really impacting the Americans at the fuel pump or in inflation or in any other places where they're getting hit.
No, it doesn't seem like they have long-term policies. It's just political reaction at this point, Leslie.
Exactly.
And I get really disgusted when people say it's the media's fault. That if the media were telling a different story, people are so stupid, they would believe that media narrative. It's not about the media. It's not about the media giving Joe Biden an unfair turn. It's about people hurting, people worrying, people coming out of a pandemic and maybe into a nuclear war. That's why his poll numbers are low. And they have to acknowledge that at some point.
Well, it's not just media, but we are influenced not just by prices at the pump or at the market or how we feel about what's happening with our paycheck and our own personal situation. We do, many of us, just read headlines and believe that. So it does factor into it. But right now, and you look at just what happened with this poll, right? He was up 7 points on COVID. Why? Because the American people have more confidence regarding COVID because masks are coming off. There's no more lockdowns. More people are going back to work. Kids are back in school. And a lot of people think, even though we do have a new variant on the horizon right now, that more than on the horizon, that COVID's in our rearview mirror. I do believe that if they view, if gas prices reduce and if Ukraine is in our rearview mirror, if there is a successful negotiation of neutrality between Ukraine and Russia, that will be the case as well. But I'm also a realist, and I'm not going to say that, he's going to catapult to, above 53%, which was where he was a year or so ago, with the midterms coming up. I'm a Democrat, certainly don't like these numbers. Obviously, no one would if it was their party that's numbers were down.
No, but they were hoping that Ukraine would be a reset, to borrow an Obama phrase, for the poll numbers, and people would see him as being strong and worldly. But instead, his response to Ukraine has tanked his poll numbers. So, there are so many ways that the federal government and the administration are failing us, Scott. And now what's happening with inflation, do you fear this administration's response to inflation, and what could that do to all the other crises people are facing?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the problem with the Federal Reserve System. This is why we have a boom and a bust crash every 10 years. It's because of artificial bank credit expansion backed up by the Federal Reserve. And here we have massive monetary inflation leading to massive price inflation. And then what happens is eventually they panic and start raising rates. And then that just means there's a crash coming. So you think you're suffering in the economy now. This is the good times. This is the bubble before the crash comes. And that policy, that paper money policy essentially, is there to back up the world empire. If we had hard money in this country, they'd have to raise our taxes to try to conquer the world the way that they do. And so instead, we have to suffer this boom and bust cycle every 10 years. And that is a huge part of why Biden's numbers are so low, is the price inflation. But think about the Democrats, after Russiagate, after the lockdowns, that was the Democratic governors more than anybody else that led the lockdowns, the vaccine passports, the price inflation now. The Democratic Party should be obliterated. And their Russia policy, their reckless policy in Eastern Europe, the Democratic Party should be polling at 0%, and the Republican Party should be running away with everything. The left half of America should have to make a whole new coalition now. But instead, the Republicans can only attack Biden for being too weak on Russia. No, we need a no-fly zone. No, we need to assassinate the president, this kind of thing. Well, that's the Republican Party leadership, but the Republican voters of America believe in America first.
Yes.
Like Ron Paul and Donald Trump both said, enough of this foreign interventionism. And so I think the Republicans are bad enough on what is the most important issue in the world. They could still lose everything to these Democrats.
So, Scott, last question. This is just a softball follow-up. So if we did get back on the gold standard, if we ended the Fed and didn't even talk about regulating crypto, would that put us on a better course?
Yes, absolutely. Listen, people should go to Mises.org. I run my own Libertarian Institute, but Mises.org, those guys are the best. The Austrian school economists, they're the only ones who can correctly explain why the economy booms and busts every 10 years.
And that's
it destroys the lives of so many people.
MISES.org. And
That's right.
the Austrians also know how to wear lederhosen better. I said it. Party panel, thank you so much for being here tonight. Chris, Leslie, and Scott, you all did a wonderful job. Thank you.